The funeral of the Pope. A sea of black veils and bowed heads stretches across St. Peter's Square. The air is so heavy that even the birds seem to fly slower. The Swiss Guard, famous for standing motionless through every storm, every sorrow, suddenly breaks rank. One armored boot steps forward. Gasps ripple through the crowd like a shockwave. Cardinals turn sharply. Pilgrims grip their rosaries. Cameras zoom in, desperate not to miss a second. But what the Guard does next will leave even the highest halls of the Vatican shaking for years to come. Before we reveal the moment that changed everything, make sure you subscribe for true stories where silence becomes strength and where courage rewrites history. The day was supposed to be flawless. Every step, every hymn, every silent prayer had been rehearsed to perfection. Bells tolled across Rome, slow and mournful, echoing through the ancient stone streets. Royal families, world leaders, and faithful pilgrims from every corner of the earth gathered beneath the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica. Rows of Swiss guards lined the square, dressed in their striking blue, red, and yellow uniforms, standing like living statues, silent, unmoving, eternal. It was not just tradition, it was law. During a papal funeral, the Swiss Guard must show no emotion, no movement, no voice, only devotion carved in flesh and steel. But among those frozen figures, one heart beat differently, because hidden behind one polished helmet was a promise too sacred to be silenced. And when the final prayer rose into the afternoon sky, that silent heart could no longer stand still. His name was Luca Benedetti. To the world, he was just another Swiss guard, another nameless figure, in the long line of loyalty that stretched back centuries. But inside that armor stood a man carrying a story too heavy for silence. Luca was not born into privilege. He came from a small village tucked into the folds of the Swiss Alps, where life was simple and hardship was common. His family had no wealth, only faith. And it was that faith that carried him through his darkest days, days when a rare illness had almost stolen his life before it ever began. Doctors gave up. Neighbors prayed. His mother wept behind closed doors. But it was a letter, carried across mountains and borders, that changed everything. A letter that reached the Vatican. A letter that somehow landed on the desk of the Pope himself. No announcements were made. No journalists were called. The Pope acted quietly, arranging for Luca's treatment, saving the life of a boy he had never even met. And now, as Luca stood at the Pope's funeral, armor shining under the Roman sun, he knew one thing. He had not come here today to guard a coffin. He had come to repay a debt written in silent kindness. The funeral procession continued as if nothing was wrong. Choirs sang ancient hymns that floated like mist over the heads of the mourners. Incense curled upward into the cold morning sky, carrying prayers, hopes, regrets. Every detail was perfectly in place as it always had been for centuries. But for Luca, standing there, locked inside that rigid formation, the world felt wrong. This was not just a farewell to a pope. It was a farewell to the only man who had ever reached across power and position to touch his life without asking anything in return. The man who had saved him, not because he was important, but because he existed. Rules said he must stay frozen. Tradition said he must remain silent. But Luca's heart said something else. It said, "This man deserves more than marble rituals and whispered prayers." As the golden casket was slowly moved toward its final resting place, Luca's pulse pounded in his ears louder than the solemn drums that echoed across the square. Each step closer to goodbye tightened something inside him, and then, without warning, Luca's hands, meant to be locked like stone, trembled once. It was barely visible to anyone else. But to Luca, it felt like an earthquake inside his armor. He knew what he was about to do would break every rule he had sworn to uphold. He also knew that some oaths, those made in silence and sealed in gratitude, were more sacred than any written law. The choice was no longer his mind's to make. It was his soul's, and his soul had already decided. The golden casket reached the center of St. Peter's Square, It rested under the heavy gaze of ancient statues and the waiting arms of history. Cardinals in crimson robes circled it like sentinels, their chants rising in slow, sorrowful waves. Thousands of mourners stood frozen. Even the birds had stopped their flight, as if the sky itself mourned. And in the middle of this sacred stillness, Luca moved. One step. The sound of his armored boot against the stone was deafening in the silence. Heads snapped toward him. Murmurs surged through the crowd. Senior officers widened their eyes in horror. A Swiss guard stepping out of line at a papal funeral? It was unthinkable, unforgivable. It had not happened in centuries. A cold wave swept through the ranks. Some guards tightened their grips on their halberds. The commander's knuckles turned white where he clutched the ceremonial staff. Every rule, said Luca, should be tackled, removed, erased from history. But Luca did not stop. He walked forward, slow and steady, every step a direct challenge to everything the ceremony demanded. And when he reached the Pope's casket, he did not bow, he did not salute. He did something far more dangerous. He knelt, not with military precision, but with the raw, vulnerable motion of a son bearing a father. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some cardinals visibly stiffened. One dropped, his prayer book. And then, Luca spoke. His voice, trembling but clear, carried across the marble like a blade through silk. You saved me when no one else would. Today I return the debt. Holy Father, your guard is dismissed. A tear slipped from beneath his helmet, catching the light like a tiny falling star. And for a moment, the entire world forgot how to breathe. Behind the walls of the Vatican, chaos erupted. The funeral was still underway in front of the world's cameras, but deep inside the hidden corridors, a different kind of ceremony began. A frantic scramble for control. Whispers turned into sharp arguments. Orders clashed in hushed, angry voices. The commander of the Swiss Guard demanded Luca's immediate arrest. Senior cardinals argued that such defiance could not be tolerated, not even for the Pope's favorite son. Others, fewer, quieter, pleaded for mercy, reminding the council that sometimes the heart must rise above the handbook. It was a dangerous debate, because if they punished Luca, they risked looking heartless before the entire Catholic world. But if they praised him, they risked breaking a tradition older than any living man. The stakes were higher than one guard's future. It was about the soul of the Vatican itself. Meanwhile, Luca knelt silently by the casket, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the firestorm igniting around him. His hands rested lightly on his knees. His head was bowed. His armor caught the afternoon light, making him look less like a man and more like a living monument to loyalty. For those few moments, Luca had become what every tradition, every oath, every word of Scripture had always hoped for. Not perfect obedience, but perfect love. And while the powerful argued over rules, the people outside already knew the truth. No law broken that day was bigger than the promise kept. Hours passed. After the funeral ended, the mourners had dispersed. The dignitaries had returned to their black cars. But inside the Vatican walls, the debate raged on like a fire no one could put out. Finally, just before midnight, the decision came. It was unprecedented, it was controversial, and it would change history. The Vatican issued an official statement to the world. Guard Luca Benedetti shall not face punishment. His actions, though outside protocol, reflected a devotion deeper than duty. His silent tribute will be remembered as an act of personal loyalty, not public rebellion. In honoring the Holy Father from the heart, he reminded us why faith must never be stripped of humanity. The announcement spread like wildfire. News anchors scrambled to cover it. Headlines exploded across every major network. Pope's funeral turns emotional, as Swiss Guard defies protocol and is praised. Social media erupted. Millions cheered. Millions cried. And somewhere, high above the ancient spires of Rome, it felt as if the Pope himself smiled. For the first time in modern memory, The Vatican had chosen heart over habit, and Luca Benedetti, once an invisible figure behind polished steel, was now etched into history not as a rebel, but as a reminder that sometimes the strongest faith is the one that dares to kneel when the world demands you stand. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that moment refused to fade. Pilgrims visiting St. Peter's Square would stop at the very spot where Luca had knelt. Some would whisper prayers, some would leave flowers. Some simply stood there staring at the cold marble where silence had once spoken louder than any choir. Inside the Vatican, a quiet change began. The Swiss Guard, an institution untouched for over 500 years, started to evolve. New recruits were taught not just about discipline and ceremony, but about the heart beneath the armor. A new line was added to their training. Loyalty is not proven by stillness alone. Sometimes true loyalty is proven when one dares to move. Luca never gave another interview. He refused every request for a book deal, every invitation to speak on talk shows. He returned quietly to his duties, guarding the sacred walls with the same silent dignity that had brought him to that day. But he was different now, not in how he stood, not in how he served, but in how he was seen. To the world, Luca Benedetti was no longer just a guard. He had become a living symbol, a bridge between tradition and humanity. A reminder that even in the oldest halls of power, the smallest act of courage could echo forever. And in the corridors where the great decisions of faith were made, his name was now spoken with the same reverence as saints. Because he had taught them all that true service does not destroy the heart, it demands it. One quiet evening, long after the headlines had faded and the cameras had packed away, Luca returned to the small village where it all began. No fanfare waited for him. No grand parades. Just familiar stone paths, weathered wooden houses, and the ringing of a single church bell that echoed across the valley like a heartbeat. At the entrance to the old church, a plaque had been mounted by the villagers. It read, simply, "Here prays the boy who stood for a world that forgot how to kneel." Luca stood before it for a long time. He remembered the days he had walked these streets as a sick child, believing the world had forgotten him. He remembered the night when a letter, carried by unknown hands, had crossed mountains and oceans to save his life. And now, he had carried that mercy back to the man who had once saved him. A soft hand touched his shoulder. He turned to find his mother standing there, tears shining in her tired eyes. "You were always a fighter," she whispered. "But I never knew you would fight with silence." Luca smiled. Small, humble, real. "It was not my silence," he said. "It was his." They entered the church together, where candles flickered against ancient walls, and for the first time since the day of the funeral, Luca knelt once again. Not in protest, not in duty, but in pure, wordless gratitude, because some debts are too sacred to repay with anything except a life well lived. The world moves fast. Traditions are replaced. Histories are forgotten. But some moments stay. A boy saved by silent kindness. A man standing alone in the center of history's gaze. A guard breaking the rules, not out of rebellion, but out of love. Luca Benedetti's story reminds us all of something the world too often forgets. True loyalty is not measured by perfect obedience. It is measured by the heart you bring to the promises you make. You can follow every rule and still lose your soul, or you can stand when standing costs you everything and become more than history ever expected. Because in the end, it is not the medals or the uniforms or the ceremonies that define a legacy. It is the quiet courage to choose love over law, honor over habit, and gratitude over silence. And sometimes, it takes just one step forward to move an entire world. If this story touched you, do not let it end here. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories where honor lives, courage speaks, and small moments echo through time. Because you never know, the next story could be yours.